Okay, we'll now begin section 3 of chapter 11, dealing with the Civil War, as the sun sets over the Gulf of Mexico here in Panama City Beach, Florida. We're going to talk about life during the war, during the Civil War, life during wartime. Again, I'd like to remind everybody this comes from the textbook, The Americans, and this is for sophomore history class, Southside High School, Gaston, Alabama. One thing that's very important to take note of is that the Civil War brought about dramatic social and economic changes in American society. The way we dealt with one another and with society in general. African Americans during the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation, were finally allowed to join the Union Army. And by the war's end, they would make up 10% of the Union Army. They still suffered severe discrimination, segregated units commanded by white officers, and they learned less than white soldiers. Many POWs were executed by Confederates on the spot, according to most people. An example would be the massacre at Fort Pillow, where General Nathan Bedford Forrest supposedly killed 200 black soldiers. Within the Confederacy itself, many slaves ran away and sought to join the Union Army as it pushed into Confederate territory. Slaves on the plantations engaged in sabotage, and slave resistance gradually weakened the plantation system. By 1864, many Confederates realized that slavery is nearing the end. Probably the most famous of the black units in the American Civil War was the 54th Massachusetts Unit. If you viewed the movie Glory, this was the movie featured in it, and famous for its assault on Fort Wagner. During the war, the Southern economy plummeted. There were food shortages. A lot of people don't understand that. They think, well, the South had a lot of agriculture. But remember, most of these were cash crops, not foodstuffs. So many of the men went to the army. Basic deeds around the house were left undone. And the Union Army occupied many of the farm areas, and the slaves left. Food prices skyrocketed, and inflation and currency chaos. At the beginning of the war, many of the Confederates gave their money to banks who transferred it to or changed it over to Confederate money. Halfway through the war, this Confederate money becomes more and more worthless, and by 1864, it was pretty much not worth the paper that it was printed on. However, during the war, the economy in the North actually grew. The Army needed war supplies, women were able to get jobs, factories sprung up all over the place, but there was war profiteering with corruption. Contractors supplied uniforms and blankets made of shoddy fibers made from rags, but nonetheless, the economy did skyrocket in the North, while it suffered severely in the South. Soldiers suffered on both sides of the conflict. There were poor living conditions, diet, and medical care. More likely than not, amputation was the primary care given to most wounds during the war. There was lack of garbage disposal in bathrooms. Disease such as dysentery, typhoid, and malaria were rampant, and the food was barely edible. One of the things during the war, however, was though we learned things that would later be used to improve conditions in other wars and the civilian life. Medicine, the United States Sanitary Commission formed to improve hygienes. They recruited and trained nurses, both men and women, and 3,000 served for the Union. Dorothea Dix became superintendent of the women nurses, and if you remember, she was an early civil rights leader. Clara Barton, known as the angel of the battlefield for caring for the sick and wounded. Clara Barton was basically America's version of Florence Nightingale. She cared for the wounded, mainly of Union soldiers, but also of Southern soldiers. She plays a large role in women's rights later, the fact that she was able to do these jobs, which, believe it or not, up before the Crimean War in Europe, most nursing duties were considered for men. You can see some of the crude tools, most of them again geared toward amputation, quinine for malaria, liquor to numb the pain, that kind of things. They never sterilized the instruments, and the effects of bacteria were unknown at the time, which led to gangrene. Blood typing, x-rays, and antibiotics were non-existent, and anesthetics were in its infancy. Ether or chloroform was the closest thing they had, or ether, excuse me, or chloroform were the closest things they had to actual anesthesia, which would put people asleep. Prisons were horrible for prisoners of war. Early in the war, they would generally work out prisoner exchanges, but before long, this wasn't doable because of the large numbers of prisons. The worst prison was the Confederate camp at Andersonville, Georgia, where 33,000 men were forced into an overcrowded camp, little or no shelter, and they drank from the same stream that their sewer was, and a third of them died. The commander of the prison camp at Andersonville was one of the few people that was executed after the war for war crimes. He was a German guard. Prison camps in the North were only slightly better. 15% of Union prisoners overall versus 12% of Confederate prisoners died. Also, we have to understand that many of these prisoners were wounded. That's why they were taken prisoners. The next section we'll talk about is called The North Takes Charge, and that will be section 4. And for right now, thank you for paying attention, and good luck.